What's going on, everyone? My name's Kevin, and today I'm going to be showing you guys a roll of Kodak Ektar 100 that I recently shot. I'm also going to be talking you through what makes this film stock special and why you might want to pick up a fresh roll for yourself to shoot. So let's get into it. Right off the bat, Kodak Ektar 100 is a special film stock because it doesn't have all the same attributes that we typically ascribe to the air quotes film look. Iconic film stocks like Kodak Portra or Kodak Gold have a radiant emphasis on warm tones with other colors that feel almost washed out for a more vintage film look, but Kodak Ektar 100 doesn't really share this. Instead, it has colors that feel more true to life and saturated. Pair this with an extremely fine grain structure and an emphasis on sharp edges, and you have a film stock that doesn't look like many others. With that fine grain structure comes a little bit of a higher price tag. 36 exposures of 35mm film costs around $16 or $17 here in the city, but it also comes in 120 and sheet film. It's also worth noting that Kodak Ektar 100 has a little bit of a precise exposure latitude, so getting consistent results can be a little bit more difficult than you might be used to. That's enough shop talk though. Now it's time to see the absolute hot messes and mild successes of this roll over the past month. Remember a few moments ago when I mentioned this film's a really precise exposure latitude? Well, that's on full display in these photos, so let's dig into it a little bit. So right now I'm going to be looking at these photos as scans just fresh back from the lab with no edits done to them, and you can see that they kind of are just a yellow-purple mess. While they look really rough, at least I understand where I went wrong. While I could probably do an entire video on this, here's the upshot. When I shoot digitally, I'm exposing for my highlights because I know that when I'm using raw files, I can get back all that shadow detail in post, so I really just need to make sure that I'm not clipping the highlights, and a lot of other stuff I can get back for a more well-exposed edit. That just isn't how film photography works. If you don't expose for everything in the scene, you simply won't get that detail. Now I tried to take this exact shot around 6 times, I think, and you can see that the neon cross is actually usually somewhat close to well exposed, but the rest of the image is mush. Now there's some other crappy photos in here that I won't show you just yet, but those are more about me being a not great photographer than they are this film stock being hard to work with. So while these photos might look like garbage, I know going forward that I should be exposing for more of the scene as a whole. And I also know now that overexposing color film is much safer than underexposing color film. When you overexpose color film by a couple stops, it looks much more normal like a regular shot than when you underexpose color film by a couple stops. Thankfully, this roll wasn't all bad, and I do have at least a couple shots that show what Kodak Ektar 100 can really do. So something that's really cool about Kodak Ektar 100 is that the colors are really true to life, and if you have a well-exposed shot, it doesn't take much editing at all. So most of the images that I am happy to show you, I barely touch. They have a little bit of color correction here and there, but that's really it. Now I actually had to re-record this portion of the video because the first time I went through, I was way too harsh on these photos, but a lot of them actually grew on me quite a bit. So let's start out with this shot of the East River. It looks pretty nice. It's nothing crazy, but I feel like it does show all the saturation and pretty colors that this film stock can bring you. And I did a bit of a wider crop on it because you don't really lose anything in the sky or the ocean by doing a panoramic crop on it. Now I have 2 pictures of Little Island here, and what I think is really interesting that these are 2 stops different in exposure, and while the highlights, like I said earlier, mostly look the same, the real difference comes in the colors in the midtones and the shadows of the reds and the greens. So you can see this first one has kind of purplish reds and bluish greens, and then if you go over to the next, you have yellowish greens and more rust orange reds. So this is the first of a couple examples where just a little bit of difference in exposure actually changes the colors of the images a lot. So this nice portrait I got of this goose in Central Park actually looks pretty nice. Unfortunately, I think it's a little bit underexposed and I missed focus just a little bit, but you can really see the saturation in the greens come out here. And again, like I said, I think this is a little bit underexposed because those greens are leaning more blue rather than yellow. I got a bunch of photos when I went to a Yankees game, but none of them are particularly exciting except for a couple that I got towards the end. So this is probably my favorite picture from this roll. I was able to crank up the shutter speed enough to capture the ball, the pitcher, the hitter, all that in a nice freeze frame. And what I was saying earlier about the colors just looking true to life when you get a good exposure with this roll, this is it. There's a couple things that I'm really happy about with this shot. One of them being just the fact that I got the exposure light. It's a tricky lighting situation because it's dark out, but there's all the stadium lights on. It's also shot in aperture, I think, of 1/7, so I'm happy that I was able to get the focus right from that distance, which is cool. And then I think it also just has a pretty interesting composition. You can see the motion in the players, and you can also see the little kid hanging over the rail in anticipation. I think it's just a nice, kind of classy looking photo. And the next photo is the biggest example of what one stop of exposure can do to a photo on Kodak Ektar 100. This is one stop underexposed compared to the previous image, and you can see that the greens again have turned to that bluish color. The brown tones of the sand have turned to like a tan leather, and you can see the shadows have turned to purplish as well. There's a couple other shots that I like in here, but we'll skip those so we can talk about how this film looks in sunlight, which I think is really something special about it. So I took this photo of a bookstore because I really liked the red door and also the gold accents with the handle and the sign that says books. And it came out even better than I thought because there's a lot of warmth to the photo, which is really nice. And that's accentuated by the amazing saturation of those bright red doors. And then it helps that someone was walking by to add a little bit of a dynamic element to the photo. Here's a portrait I got of Kendra, which I think might be a stop or two underexposed. And this is the photo that I edited the most, so you can see a fairly significant difference in the before and after. I think the only portrait I took on this roll, but I like it a decent bit. This is a pretty simple street shot of just some buildings that looked pretty, and I didn't think too much of it, but I actually like it a lot, and it reminds me of the same kind of warmth that comes out of the brick buildings as the bookstore shot. And then to wrap up, the highlights of this roll is just this big tree with the sunlight coming through the leaves. And here you can really see when the leaves get the light on them and they have that warm color, Kodak Ektar 100 will definitely pick it up and show off that radiant yellow light. So while I had a handful of shots in this roll that I did end up liking, my results were far from consistent, and obviously the best way to improve consistency would be to use a light meter so I know what I'm looking at, and I actually am considering doing that if I shoot this film stock again, because I think I do want more precise results with something as precise as Ektar 100. And they also make light meters that go in the shoe mount of your camera, so that seems pretty cool. I'm about to check them out. So yeah, of course a light meter will help increase your consistency, but I think there's two other things. The first being really accounting for your shadows, because if you don't account for your shadows, they will certainly disappear on this film stock. It's not like black and white, and I think it's even a bit more severe than something like Portrait 400. The other thing is to know what you're looking for, because I think there's a few different looks that Kodak Ektar 100 actually has to offer. Now, as you saw in my images, if you underexpose by a stop or two, your greens turn a little more blue and your reds turn a little more purple. So if that's what you're looking for, I think you can actually underexpose a stop or two to consistently get that style. Whereas if you consistently expose regularly or maybe even go a bit above normal exposure, I think you'll get those warmer tones, those yellow greens and those orange reds. So yeah, that's really up to you, but I think if you are being careful enough, you can actually get consistent results with certain color styles. Now, a new portion of this style video that I want to try out is actually a stat sheet, and this is really just for me to document from roll to roll what I'm doing so I can improve accordingly. So let's review this roll of Kodak Ektar 100. I got 25 sharp images, but I think is actually pretty good because I realized on this roll that when I focus out to infinity on my camera, it's actually not in focus at all, so I have to dial it back a little bit. I think I'll find that out for sure on the next roll that I shoot, but I think that's not a bad place to be. I had 13 images underexposed and 0 overexposed, which isn't particularly surprising because I probably spent 6 or 7 shots trying to get that neon sign, and I did a bunch of other shots at dusk, so I'm not surprised that I had underexposed photos at dusk with a 100 ISO film stock. I ended up with 7 images that I think are solid, which is good enough for me at least to prove to the world that I didn't actually just throw this roll of film into the trash. Lastly, I had 0 photos that I think are excellent, and that's not particularly surprising to me because I only expect to get a handful of those every year. So I think I should probably have some sort of grading system for this, but I don't really know how I would do that, so my gut is going to give this roll a C+. In the end, even though I didn't get anything too special on this roll, I really like what Kodak Ektar 100 has to offer. I like that it's capable of these blue tinted saturated greens, but also has a really warm glow with the right mix of sunlight on the subject. And like I mentioned in the beginning, those super saturated colors are one of the biggest draws of this film stock. And if you expose your images well, your pictures will require almost no editing and they'll look pretty much true to life. Now, as you'd expect with a 100 ISO film stock, if you have lots of light and you like colors and contrast that really pops, this is a stock worth trying so long as you're willing to spend a little more money on it. So yeah, that's my experience and thoughts on Kodak Ektar 100. I hope this video was enjoyable or at least helped you learn a little bit about Kodak Ektar 100. I'm trying to mess around with the video formula for these film stock reviews to make them, like I said, a little bit helpful or at least a little bit interesting. So if you have any comments or critiques about this video style, be sure to let me know down in the comments below. You can also see these photos over on Instagram, where I'm very active now at kcockerline, or you can check out the blog post that I wrote about Kodak Ektar 100. Thank you guys so much for hanging around, and I'll see you in the next one real soon. Take it easy, y'all.